Calvin Drake didn't knock. That was the first thing the ranch hands noticed. The man in the black coat pushed the gate open like he already owned the place. Because, in his mind, he did. He walked straight past the foreman without a word, past the water trough, past the three men who stopped mid-work just to stare. His boots didn't slow down until he reached the porch steps. Then he pulled out a folded document, held it up in the air like a flag of conquest, and said 4 words that made every man within earshot go cold. "This land is mine." Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Because standing in the doorway, with flour still dusted on her hands and a child's mended shirt hanging over her shoulder, was Evelyn Mercer, the woman who had spent 2 years bleeding for every inch of that ground. And she looked at Calvin Drake the way a person looks at something they've been expecting for a long time. Before we go any further, if this is your first time here, welcome. If you've been with us before, you already know what kind of stories we tell. Stories about ordinary people who refuse to give up when everything is stacked against them. Stories that'll make you angry and then make you proud, and maybe, just maybe, make you think about what you would have done. Hit that subscribe button right now so you don't miss a single one. And when you're done watching, drop a comment telling me the city and country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Every single comment means something to me. Now, let's go back to the beginning. The morning Luke Callahan rode back into Harlan County, the sky was the kind of pale gray that couldn't decide whether it wanted to rain or just sit there looking miserable. 2 years. 700 and some odd days of dust and river crossings and sleeping on hard ground with one eye open. 700 days of telling himself the same thing every night before he closed his eyes. Hold on. Just hold on a little longer. He was 31 years old and looked 45. His horse, a buckskin named Cedar, that had been with him since before his father died, moved slower than she used to. Luke couldn't blame her. He felt the same way. His boots were worn clean through on the left heel. His coat had a tear along the right shoulder he'd patched himself with a strip of canvas from a feed sack. He hadn't shaved in 3 weeks. He'd stopped caring somewhere around the Texas Panhandle. But he was coming home. That was what mattered. Except Luke Callahan wasn't entirely sure what home meant anymore. His father, Thomas Callahan, had died owing more money than most men made in a decade. Not because Thomas was a bad man. He wasn't. He was the kind of man who trusted too easily, who shook hands with people who should have required signatures, who believed that if you worked hard enough and meant well enough, the arithmetic would eventually sort itself out. It didn't. When he died, the Bar W Ranch, 340 acres of Wyoming grassland that the Callahan family had worked since Luke was 5 years old, sat buried under debt that Luke had no way to pay from where he was standing. So he did the only thing he could think of. He signed on with a cattle drive going south, then another one heading west, then a third one that took him so far from Wyoming he sometimes had to remind himself which direction home was. He sent every dollar he could back to the county land office, addressed to the account registered against the Bar W, with a note that always said the same thing: more coming. Don't touch the land. He had no way of knowing if it worked, no address to receive letters at, no way to telephone anybody, even if there had been people to call. He just rode and worked and sent money and prayed the math would hold. Now he was riding home to find out. The road that turned off toward the Bar W was the same road he'd ridden away on 2 years ago, but something felt different about it before he could even say what. The fencing along the east pasture, and Luke remembered very clearly that 3 sections of that fencing had been down when he left. The posts rotted out from a wet spring, was standing. Not just standing, it was new. The posts were straight, the wire was tight, and someone had painted the gate at the end of the lane a dark red that Luke had never seen on Callahan property before. He slowed Cedar to a walk without meaning to. His eyes moved over the pasture beyond the fence, and he felt something cold settle in his chest that had nothing to do with the weather. There were cattle out there, a real herd, not the scraggly dozen head his father had been nursing along at the end. Maybe 60, 70 animals, and from where he sat on the road, they looked healthy. Their coats were full. They were moving the way cattle move when they've been eating properly and not scrambling for grass that isn't there. Luke sat on Cedar for a long moment without moving. Then he made himself keep riding. The house came into view around the bend, and that was when something in his chest cracked open in a way he wasn't prepared for. Because the Bar W house, the house where his mother had died when he was 12, the house his father had slowly let fall apart in his grief, the house with the broken front step and the roof that leaked over the kitchen and the windows that had been covered with oilskin for 2 winters running. That house was not the same house he had left. The front step was fixed, the porch boards were solid, the roof had new shingles, the kitchen window had actual glass in it, and through that glass, in the gray morning light, Luke could see yellow curtains. Yellow. His mother used to have yellow curtains. He hadn't thought about that in years, and seeing them there, in a window that hadn't had curtains since he was a boy, hit him somewhere beneath the ribs with a force that had no name. He stopped Cedar at the end of the lane and just looked. There was smoke coming from the chimney. The wood stack beside the front door was 3 feet high and neatly split. The garden plot along the south wall, which his father had given up on years before he died, showed the dark, turned earth of something recently worked. This did not look like an abandoned property. This did not look like a ranch teetering on the edge of foreclosure. This looked like a home that somebody loved. Luke dismounted slowly, his knees protesting after months on horseback, and tied Cedar to the post at the end of the lane. He walked toward the house. His hat was in his hands before he realized he'd taken it off. Some instinct he couldn't name had taken over. He was 10 feet from the porch when the front door opened. The woman who stepped out was not anyone he had ever seen before in his life. She was maybe 28, 29. Brown hair pulled back practical, not pretty. The hair of someone who didn't have time to think about how it looked. She was wearing a work dress that had seen better days, with an apron over it that had flour on it, and what looked like motor grease near the hem, which struck Luke as an unusual combination. She wasn't tall. She wasn't what anyone would call imposing. But she stood on his porch with the straightness of someone who had every right to be exactly where she was. She looked at him the way you look at someone you've been expecting, not surprised, not afraid, just steady. "You'd be Luke Callahan," she said. It wasn't a question. Luke stopped walking. "I would be," he said carefully, "and you'd be Evelyn Mercer." She came down the front step, his front step, newly fixed, and stopped at the bottom. "I've been managing the Bar W for the past 22 months. The silence that followed that sentence was the loudest thing Luke had heard since a thunderstorm over the Cimarron 2 months back. "I'm sorry," he said. "You've been managing the ranch." She said it again, same tone. No apology in it, no question. "Someone had to." Luke looked at her, looked past her at the house, looked at the pasture he'd ridden past with its solid fences and healthy cattle, looked back at her. "Where's Hatch?" he asked. Hatch was the foreman his father had hired 12 years ago, a man named Harold Hutchins, who went by nothing else. "Out mending the north fence line," Evelyn said, "same as he does on Tuesdays." "And the ranch hands?" "4 of them, Reuben, Gordy, Tom Stills, and a young man named Pete, who started 6 months ago. They're all working." She folded her hands in front of her apron. "I didn't send anyone away, if that's what you're asking." Luke stared at her for another moment. Then he said very quietly, "Ma'am, I don't know who you are or how you came to be standing on my property, but I think you need to explain this to me from the beginning." Something shifted almost imperceptibly in her face. Not offense, more like someone absorbing a small disappointment they had already anticipated. "Yes," she said. "I suppose I do." She turned and walked back up the steps and held the door open. After a moment, Luke followed her inside. The kitchen smelled like bread baking and something else, wood smoke and beeswax and the particular smell of a house that was lived in and cared for. Luke had forgotten that smell. He stood in the kitchen of the house he'd grown up in and did not recognize it, and he could not decide if that was a good thing or not. Evelyn poured 2 cups of coffee from the pot on the stove, set them on the table without asking, and sat down across from the chair that was clearly meant for him. Luke sat. He wrapped his hands around the cup. The coffee was good, black, no sugar, the way ranch coffee was supposed to be, and he drank half of it before he looked at her again. "Talk," he said. Evelyn talked. She told it plainly, the way she seemed to do everything. 16 months after Luke had left, a man named Calvin Drake, who ran Harlan County's only bank and operated with the ethics of a coyote in a henhouse, had come out to the Bar W with a foreclosure notice. The note on the property, she explained, had been sold after Thomas Callahan's death, sold to Drake without Luke's knowledge. and the money Luke had been sending to the county land office had not been going toward the debt at all. It had been going into a general account that Drake had quietly redirected. Luke set down his coffee cup. "He redirected my payments," he said. He said it slowly, like a man working out an arithmetic problem he already knew he wasn't going to like the answer to. "To an account he controlled, yes." Evelyn's voice was even. "By the time I found out, he had let the interest compound until the balance was almost double what your father had originally borrowed. He came out here with legal papers and 2 men, and he told Hatch that the property would be seized in 30 days unless the full balance was paid. And what was Hatch going to do? He was going to write you a letter and hope it found you somewhere." Evelyn paused. "Which wasn't a plan." Luke almost smiled at that. Almost. "No," he agreed. "It wasn't." "I was in Harlan at the time," Evelyn said. "I had arrived 3 weeks before, handling matters for my husband's estate." She said husband the way people say certain words when the wound is still present, but they've learned to speak around it. Careful, deliberate, no inflection. "I had inherited some capital from Martin's family, and I had no particular attachment to staying in Missouri. I heard about the situation with the ranch at the feed store." "You heard about it at the feed store," Luke repeated. "Mrs. Purdy at the feed store knows everything that happens in this county," Evelyn said, without any irony whatsoever. Luke rubbed his face with both hands. He had a headache forming behind his left eye that he suspected was going to be with him for a while. "And you decided to—" He stopped. "Why? You didn't know me. You didn't know this place." For the first time, something moved in Evelyn Mercer's expression that was harder to read. She looked down at her coffee cup, then back at him. "I know what it's like to have something taken from you through someone else's dishonesty," she said. "And I know what it's like when nobody does anything because they've already decided the ending." She said it flat, without drama, which somehow made it land harder. "I didn't want to know what it felt like to be that person who watched and did nothing." The kitchen was quiet. Outside, Luke could hear wind picking up across the pasture. "What did you do?" he asked. "I went to see the county recorder," she said. "I found a provision in your father's original deed that allowed for a third-party legal partnership in the case of the owner's absence or incapacitation. It was a standard clause in deeds from that era. Most people didn't even know it existed." She paused. "I hired a lawyer, a real one, not the one Drake used, and I filed for partnership status. It took 11 days and cost me more than I'll tell you, but it held up. Drake couldn't foreclose on a legally partnered property without a hearing, and by the time the hearing came around, I had paid down enough of the principal to change the legal standing entirely." Luke looked at her across the table. A complete stranger. A woman he had never met, who had never met him, who had walked into a bank dispute that was none of her business and spent her own inherited money to stop a foreclosure on a property she had no claim to. "You did that," he said, "for a ranch you'd never seen and an owner you'd never met." "I did that," she said, "because it was the right thing to do, and there wasn't anyone else in the room who was going to." Luke said nothing for a long time. "How much do I owe you?" he finally asked. Evelyn shook her head. "That's not why I told you." "That doesn't answer my question." "No," she agreed. "It doesn't." She stood, collected both coffee cups, and set them in the basin. "There's a ledger in the desk in your father's office. Everything is in there. Every dollar in, every dollar out. Every payment to Drake's bank, every repair, every purchase. I kept records of everything." She untied her apron and hung it on the peg beside the stove, the same peg Luke's mother had always used, which she couldn't have known. "I assumed you'd want to see the numbers before anything else." Luke stood. "I want to see the cattle first." Evelyn nodded like that made sense. "I'll get my coat." He looked at her. "I wasn't inviting— You'll have questions about the herd that I'm the only one who can answer," she said, not unkindly. "And Hatch won't be back from the north fence for another 3 hours." Luke looked at her for a long moment. He was exhausted. He was confused. I was standing in a kitchen that smelled like his childhood, in a house that had been transformed by someone he'd met 20 minutes ago. He had spent 2 years carrying the weight of this place in his chest like a stone, and now he was standing in it, and somehow the weight hadn't lifted. It had just changed shape into something he didn't have a word for yet. "Get your coat," he said. They walked out together into the gray morning. The pasture was bigger than he remembered, or maybe it just looked bigger when it was full of cattle and the fences weren't falling over. Luke walked the fence line slowly, his hands in his pockets, and Evelyn walked beside him and answered questions before he'd finished asking them. The herd came from two separate purchases. The first, 17 head she'd bought from a neighboring ranch at below market price when they were offloading stock. The second, 41 head from an estate sale in the next county. She'd had the well on the south pasture redug because the original had gone bad, and the cost of that had nearly broken the budget for that quarter. The two men who'd helped with the well work were also the ones who'd repaired the north fence the previous winter. Luke listened to all of this with his hat in his hands and the wind cold on his face. At one point, Cedar, who had followed them out of some horse loyalty Luke had long since given up trying to understand, walked up behind Evelyn and pushed her nose into the back of the woman's shoulder. Evelyn didn't flinch. She just reached back and scratched the horse along the jaw without looking, the way people do when they're used to being around animals. "She likes you," Luke said. "She came up to the fence the first week I was here," Evelyn said. "I gave her half an apple. She's been following me around ever since." She paused. "Cedar's her name?" "Has been since she was 2. Evelyn nodded. She didn't say anything sentimental about it. He appreciated that. They were coming back around toward the south pasture gate when Luke stopped walking. He stopped because he'd just seen something he hadn't noticed on the way out. At the far end of the south fence, the very corner post that his father had been meaning to replace since Luke was 17 years old, the post that had been rotted at the base and leaning at an angle that made the whole section unreliable. There was a new post. Cedar wood, 6 inches square, set deep in the ground and straight as a church steeple. It was a small thing. In the scope of everything else he'd seen, it was a very small thing. But Luke Callahan stood and looked at that fence post for longer than made any practical sense, because he knew exactly how much work it took to pull a rotted post out of frozen Wyoming ground in winter, and he was doing the math on when that fence would have needed fixing, and the math was telling him that Evelyn Mercer had done it in January. He turned to look at her. She was watching him look at the fence post. "That one gave us trouble," she said. "I imagine it did," he said. They stood there in the cold, not saying anything, while the cattle moved in the pasture behind them, and Cedar's breath made small clouds in the morning air, and something passed between Luke Callahan and Evelyn Mercer in that silence that neither of them was ready to name. It was the beginning of something. Neither of them knew yet how much it was going to cost them to keep it. Luke spent the rest of that first day doing what he always did when he didn't know how to feel about something. He worked. He pulled on the old coat he'd left hanging in the barn 2 years ago, the one that still smelled faintly of cedar and his father's pipe tobacco, and he went out and worked until his shoulders ached and his hands remembered what they were for. He walked every fence line he could reach before dark. He checked the water levels in the stock tanks. He went through the hay barn and did the mental arithmetic on feed reserves, and the numbers were better than he had any right to expect. Hatch found him in the barn around 4 in the afternoon. Harold Hutchins was 63 years old, with the posture of a man who'd spent 4 decades arguing with weather and losing, a face like cracked leather, and eyes that missed very little. He'd been foreman on the Bar W since Luke was 19. He was the closest thing to family Luke had left. Hatch leaned against the barn door and looked at Luke for a moment without saying anything. Then he said, "You look terrible." "I know," Luke said. "How was the drive?" "Long." Luke straightened up from the water tank he'd been inspecting. "The Cimarron crossing nearly took 3 men and 100 head in August. We lost 11 cattle and 1 good horse." He paused. "Everyone made it." Hatch nodded, absorbing this. "You've seen the place." "I've seen the place." Luke set down the measuring rod. "I've met her." "Evelyn." Hatch said the name without any particular inflection, but there was something in it. A weight. Like a man who has a lot to say and is waiting to be asked. "Tell me," Luke said. Hatch was quiet for a moment, studying the middle distance through the barn door. Outside, the last of the afternoon light was going flat and gray. "When Drake came out here with those papers," Hatch said slowly, "I didn't know what to do. I wrote you 3 letters, Luke. 3. Sent them to every forwarding address I had. Never heard back." He paused. "I figure none of them found you." "They didn't. I thought about fighting it. Didn't know how. Lawyer in town is Drake's cousin, if you can believe that." Hatch made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "The hands were ready to pack up. I told them to wait. I didn't know what I was waiting for. He looked at Luke. Then Evelyn Mercer walked in from Harlan one afternoon with a man from Cheyenne in a suit and a briefcase, and she sat down at your father's desk and she started making calls. And I thought, well, either this woman knows something I don't, or she's about to make everything considerably worse. He paused. Turned out to be the first one. You trusted her? Hatch took a moment before answering. That was the most honest thing about him. He never gave you an answer faster than the truth allowed. Not at first, he said. First 3 months, I watched everything she did. She knew it, and she didn't say anything about it. She just kept working. He shifted against the door frame. There was a night in November, first year she was here. Blizzard came in fast. You know how they do. And we had about 40 head out on the South Range, and the temperature dropped 15 degrees in 2 hours. She went out with Reuben and Gordy, and they spent 4 hours in that storm pushing cattle to shelter. She didn't have to. She could have stayed in the house and said it wasn't her livestock to lose. He looked at Luke again. She didn't stay in the house. Luke said nothing. I trust her, Hatch said, which for a man like Hatch was roughly equivalent to a formal declaration. Luke picked up the measuring rod again and didn't reply, but he heard it. That evening he sat in his father's office, in the chair his father had sat in for 30 years, and he opened the ledger Evelyn had left for him on the desk. He told himself he'd look at it for an hour. He was still there at midnight. She had recorded everything, and he meant everything. Every dollar received, every dollar spent, every negotiation, every payment, every repair, every decision, annotated with dates and brief explanations that were so precise they felt almost forensic. There was a column she'd labeled Disputed that recorded every instance where someone had tried to overcharge or underpay the ranch, along with the outcome. She had won most of them. The ones she'd lost were annotated with what she'd learned and how she'd adjusted. There was a page near the back that wasn't financial. It was a record of decisions made during his absence. Large decisions. The kind that an owner would normally make. They were all there, laid out plainly, with the reasoning for each one, the alternatives she had considered, and the results. It read less like a business record and more like a report to someone she expected to come back and question her. She had always expected him to come back and question her. Luke closed the ledger at 12:30 in the morning and sat in the dark for a while, not thinking about money at all. The next morning, he found Evelyn in the barn before sunrise, which was where he'd apparently made the mistake of being surprised, because Gordy, one of the hands, a big, quiet man from Montana, told him with zero expression that Evelyn was in the barn before sunrise every single morning without exception. Every morning? Luke asked. Every morning, Gordy said. Luke found her in the far stall, kneeling in the straw beside a young calf that had been born 3 weeks early and was not thriving. She was feeding it from a bottle, holding the calf's head steady with one hand, keeping her movements slow and deliberate so as not to startle it. She looked up when Luke came in. This one's been a problem, she said without preamble. Born early, wouldn't latch. We've been bottle feeding for 2 weeks. Luke crouched down to look at the calf. It was small, its ribs visible, but it was drinking. Its eyes were clear. "It gonna make it?" he asked. "I don't know," Evelyn said. "I've been saying yes every day for 2 weeks because the other option is a lot more permanent." She kept her eyes on the calf. "Some mornings, that's the best you can do." Luke watched her for a moment. Her hands were steady and patient in a way that spoke of practice. Not the practice of someone who had learned from books, but the practice of someone who had learned from failure, which is a harder teacher and a better one. "I've been reading the ledger," he said. "I figured you would. You recorded every decision you made while I was gone." "Yes." "Why?" Evelyn lifted her eyes from the calf for a moment, looked at him, and then looked back. "Because they weren't my decisions to make," she said simply. "I made them because they had to be made and there wasn't anyone else to make them. But they were your decisions. I kept records so that when you came back you'd know everything, and if I'd done something wrong you could know that too." "Did you do anything wrong?" "The south well," she said without hesitating. "I waited 3 months too long to have it redug because I was trying to save money. I lost 2 calves that summer that I can't prove it, but I think might have made it if the water supply had been better. That cost was mine to carry." She paused. "I also trusted a supply merchant in town named Briggs for about 4 months longer than I should have. He was skimming on the grain weights, Gordy figured it out. I should have figured it out sooner. Luke looked at her. Most people, when asked what they'd done wrong, gave you a defense with an apology attached. She had given him an accounting. "What'd you do about Briggs?" he asked. "Stopped buying from him, switched to a merchant in the next town over, even though it costs more in transport, because the weights are honest." She glanced up. "It's in the ledger." "I saw it." The calf finished the bottle and Evelyn set it aside, smoothing one hand along the animal's neck and watching to see if it would stand. It did, unsteadily, and she let it find its balance without helping. "I need to ask you something," Luke said. She waited. "The legal partnership," he said. "Does it expire?" Evelyn was quiet for just a moment too long. Just a beat. "The terms are in the filing at the county courthouse," she said. "Your lawyer should review them. I'm asking you." She stood brushing straw from the front of her dress. "It doesn't expire," she said. "The partnership is permanent unless dissolved by both parties in writing or by a court order." "So legally," Luke said, "you own a share of this ranch." "Legally," Evelyn said carefully, "I am a partner in its operation. The percentage is documented in the filing. It's not—" She stopped. "I didn't do this to claim your land, Luke." "I didn't say you did." "No, but you were about to think it." She met his eyes for the first time since the conversation had started, and there was something in hers that was not quite defiance and not quite hurt, something in between that he didn't have a word for. "I did what I did because it needed doing and because I had the means to do it. What you do with the legal arrangement is your business. I'll sign whatever you need me to sign." "I haven't asked you to sign anything." "I know." She picked up the empty bottle and walked past him toward the barn door. "Breakfast is at 6. You look like you haven't eaten a proper meal in 3 months. She was gone before he could respond, which he suspected was deliberate. Reuben, the oldest of the hands, was a wiry Mexican man of about 50 who had come to the Bar W as a temporary hire in Evelyn's first month and had never left. He found Luke that afternoon mending tack in the equipment shed and pulled up a stool without being invited, which was a habit Luke remembered in hands who'd been somewhere long enough to feel entitled to their opinions. "She's the one who found the drainage problem on the east field," Reuben said, with no introduction, as if they'd already been talking about this. "2 summers ago. Big wet spring, water was sitting on the East 40 and killing the grass. I thought we just had to wait it out." He threaded a leather strap through a buckle with practiced hands. "She figured out there was an old ditch that had silted over from your grandfather's time. She had me dig it out over 3 days, save that whole pasture." Luke said nothing. He'd noticed the east field yesterday, green and solid, the grass thick the way it hadn't been in years. "When the price of beef dropped last spring," Reuben continued, "she switched part of the herd to selling breeding stock instead of beef cattle. Got a better price per head and kept our numbers up. She'd been watching the market reports for 6 months before she made the call." "You're making a case for her," Luke said. "I'm telling you facts," Reuben said. "You can do what you want with them." He finished with the strap and stood up. At the door he paused. "She paid Tom Still's doctor bill when his boy got sick last winter. Out of her own pocket, said it came out of operating expenses, and wrote it in the ledger as staff welfare." He looked back at Luke. "Tom knows the truth. All of us do." He left. Luke sat alone in the equipment shed with the tack in his hands and the smell of leather and oil around him and the particular silence of a place where a lot of people had told him something important without ever raising their voices. He went looking for Evelyn that evening and found her at the kitchen table with the account book spread out around her, writing figures in a column with the focused economy of someone who didn't have time to do things twice. She didn't look up when he came in. He poured himself coffee, sat down across from her, and waited. After a few minutes, she set down the pen. "You want to know about the flood," she said. He hadn't mentioned the flood, but Reuben or Gordy must have, because she said it like she'd been waiting for the question. "Tell me about the flood," he said. She was quiet for a moment, and for the first time since he'd arrived, something shifted in the set of her jaw, something that was the opposite of her usual composure. Not quite vulnerability, more like the face of someone looking at a memory that still had teeth in it. "October 18 months ago," she said. "The creek came up faster than anyone predicted. We had 3 days of rain after a dry summer, the ground was too hard to absorb it, and by midnight on the 3rd night the lower pasture was underwater. We had maybe 30 head down there." She paused. "I went down with Hatch and Pete. Pete was 17 at the time. The water was chest high in places. It was dark. The cattle were panicking. How many did you lose? Luke asked. 4, she said. We got 26 out. She picked up the pen again, set it down. I don't remember much about the water itself. What I remember is Hatch's voice in the dark, and counting animals and thinking, just keep counting, you can fall apart later. Keep counting. Did you? Luke asked. Fall apart later? She looked at him. In the barn, after, she said. For about 10 minutes. She said it matter-of-factly. Then I made a list of what needed to be done in the morning and went to sleep. Luke looked at his coffee. My father lost 8 head in a flood once, he said. When I was 14. He cried. He thought I was asleep, but I wasn't. He paused. He was embarrassed about it afterward, which was the saddest part. It was the most personal thing he'd said since he arrived, and he wasn't entirely sure why he'd said it. Evelyn didn't respond immediately. She just nodded slowly, like she was filing it away carefully. He sounds like a good man, she said. How is a good man who made bad financial decisions, Luke said. There's a lot of those. Yes, Evelyn said. There are. They sat with that for a moment. Evelyn, he said, what happened to your husband? She'd known this question was coming. He could tell by the way she didn't flinch. Fever, she said. 3 years ago. It came on fast. He was gone in 8 days. She was quiet. Martin was a good man, kind. Not very practical, but kind. He left me enough to survive and not quite enough to stay where I was. Missouri. St. Louis. His family was there. After he died, the family was, she chose her word carefully, less welcoming than they'd been when he was alive. I needed somewhere to be that was mine. And you picked a foreclosure dispute in Wyoming. I picked a problem that needed solving, she said. The Wyoming part was circumstantial. Luke almost laughed. It was the first time since he'd arrived that his chest felt even marginally lighter. I owe you money, he said again. You don't. The partnership filing, the back payment to Drake, is covered by the partnership agreement, she said firmly, which you would know if you'd read the filing instead of just the ledger. I'll read the filing. Good. He pushed back from the table and carried his cup to the basin. He stood with his back to her for a moment, looking out the window at the dark yard. I want to understand something, he said. You came to a county you'd never been to, spent your inheritance on a ranch belonging to a man you'd never met, worked this land for nearly 2 years in floods and blizzards and Lord knows what else, kept records of every single decision you made so you could hand them to me when I showed up. He turned around. And you didn't know I was coming back. Evelyn held his gaze. No, she said. I didn't. What if I hadn't? He asked. What if I'd died on the trail? What if I'd just not come back? She was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind moved across the eaves of the house. Then the ranch would have kept going, she said. The hands would have kept their jobs. The cattle would have been healthy. The land would have been worth something. She paused. That seemed like enough. Luke looked at her for a long time. That's either the most selfless thing I've ever heard, he said, or you're leaving something out. The corners of her mouth moved. Not quite a smile. Something more private than that. Probably a little of both, she said. I'm not a saint, Luke. I'm a widow from Missouri who needed somewhere to put her grief and her money that wasn't her late husband's family's dining room. And this was that place? She looked around the kitchen for a moment, at the curtains, at the repaired window, at the shelves she'd built along the east wall when there'd been nowhere to put the preserving jars. This became that place, she said. There was a weight to it that told him she'd surprised herself with that answer, even as she gave it. Luke nodded. He put on his coat. I'm doing the morning rounds tomorrow at 5, he said. If you want to walk the north pasture with me, I have questions about the second well. She looked at him. 5 is fine, she said. He went out into the cold, and behind him he heard her turn the lamp down, and the house went quiet in the way that houses do when the people inside them have said something important and need time to carry it. 3 days passed, and they found a rhythm that surprised them both. Luke would have said he was a man who did not adapt quickly to having someone in his space, a judgment formed from years of working alone or in the company of strangers who didn't ask questions. Evelyn was not a person who demanded space in obvious ways. She didn't fill silence unnecessarily. She didn't explain herself unless asked. She appeared in the places where work needed doing and disappeared when it didn't, with the efficiency of someone whose time had always been her own resource to manage. But she was also, and this was the thing Luke hadn't anticipated, frequently right. The second morning, walking the north fence, he pointed out a section she'd had reinforced with a double wire run that struck him as more work than necessary for a fence that wasn't under particular strain. She told him, without any heat in it, that the section was over a drainage depression that flooded every spring and that standard single wire wouldn't hold the post pressure once the ground softened. He looked at the ground. She was right. He didn't say so out loud, but she saw him look and she knew, and she didn't make anything of it. The third morning, he came into the kitchen at 5:15 to find her already gone. Gordy was eating at the table and told him she'd gone to town with the wagon at 4:30 because the feed merchant had sent word the night before that a shipment was in and there was one other buyer competing for it. She'd bought the whole shipment before 8 in the morning and was back at the ranch by noon. The price per unit was 12 cents lower than their usual supplier, and she'd negotiated the delivery fee to half. Luke stood in the yard watching her drive the wagon in and tried to think of a single thing she had done since he arrived that had been wrong or wasteful or short-sighted. He couldn't think of one. That evening, Hatch found him at the south gate and stood with him for a while watching the herd move in the fading light. "Drake is going to come back," Hatch said. Luke had been waiting for someone to say this. He'd been thinking it himself since the first morning, ever since Evelyn had explained what the man had done with his payments. "I know," Luke said. "He doesn't like losing," Hatch said, "and he's got more legal tools than most men know what to do with." "What do you know about him?" Hatch was quiet for a moment. "I know he's been trying to consolidate land in this county for 5 years. Bought up 3 ranches through foreclosure, 2 through partnerships that turned bad in ways that always seemed to benefit Drake." He paused. "I know that one of those partnership disputes ended up in a court in Cheyenne, and the other party left the county afterward with considerably less than they'd come in with." Luke looked at him. "You think he'll come after the partnership?" "I think if he can find a way to challenge Evelyn's legal standing," Hatch said carefully, "he'll challenge it. And I think if he can separate the two of you, legally, I mean, he can work on each piece separately." He paused. "A man with resources and patience and no particular ethics is a specific kind of dangerous." Luke said nothing for a moment. The cattle moved and settled in the fading light. "She's not going to tell me this herself," he said. It wasn't a question. "She doesn't like asking for help," Hatch said, "which you may have noticed." He pulled his coat closer. "Also, I think she doesn't want you to feel like you owe her anything more than you already do." "And what do I owe her?" Luke said, mostly to himself. Hatch looked at him from under the brim of his hat with the expression of a man who has watched people make complicated situations out of simple ones for 63 years. "That," he said, "is something only you can work out." He turned and walked back toward the bunkhouse. "Don't take too long about it." That night, Luke sat in his father's chair in the dark office, not reading anything, just thinking. He thought about Hatch's warning. He thought about Calvin Drake, and a banker with patience and no ethics, and 5 years of practice swallowing up land in Harlan County. He thought about 3 partnership disputes that ended badly, and about a woman who had arrived in this county knowing none of that and filed a legal document anyway. He thought about her saying, "In the kitchen," that seemed like enough. The problem with Evelyn Mercer, he was beginning to understand, was not that she was difficult to trust. The problem was that she was not difficult enough. That every question he had come to this ranch ready to ask her had been answered, and every answer had made him feel the ground shifting slightly under his feet. The way ground shifts when you've been walking in one direction for a long time, and something up ahead is not what you expected. He was not a man who changed direction easily. 2 years on the trail had made him more fixed in his habits, not less. I was used to knowing what he was doing and why, and he was not used to arriving somewhere and finding that most of the knowing had already been done by someone else. But the Bar W was standing, the cattle were healthy, the hands were fed and paid and still here, the fences that had been rotting were solid. The well that had been failing was redug. The flood had been survived, the banker had been fought off. Tom Stills's boy had gotten his medicine. The woman had done all of that alone, and she had done it without ever being told to, without any guarantee of thanks or payment or return, for a ranch and an owner she had no reason to care about until she decided she did. Luke Callahan was not the kind of man who let things like that sit unexamined in a back corner of his mind for very long. He stood up from his father's chair, went to bed, and lay in the dark staring at the ceiling while the Wyoming wind moved over the roof of a house that someone had repaired with their own hands while he was away. Outside, somewhere on the south pasture, one of the new cattle made a low sound and was answered by another, and then it was quiet. He thought about Calvin Drake. He thought about the ledger. He thought about a woman who went out in a blizzard with 2 ranch hands because the other option was too permanent. And somewhere in the space between waking and sleep, Luke Callahan understood, with the certainty of a man who had spent 2 years learning to read terrain, that whatever was coming next was going to require more than one person to face. The question was whether either of them was ready to admit it. Calvin Drake arrived on a Wednesday, which Luke would remember later as an oddly specific detail to hold on to. Not the cold, not the mud on the road from 2 days of rain, not even the sound of the wagon wheels on the gate cattle guard. Just the day. Wednesday. The middle of the week, which felt intentional somehow, like a man who chose his timing the way a card player chose his seat. Luke was at the equipment shed when Pete came running, which was how Luke learned that Pete, at 17, ran everywhere regardless of urgency, but also knew when something was actually urgent. The look on the boy's face was the second kind. "Man at the gate," Pete said, slightly out of breath. "Black coat. Got a wagon and another fellow with him carrying a bag." "What kind of bag?" "Lawyer kind," Pete said, which was not a precise description but was somehow adequate. Luke set down the hinge he'd been working on. He wiped his hands on a rag and took his time about it. Not because he wasn't concerned, but because he had learned a long time ago that you did not let men like Calvin Drake see you hurry toward them. It gave them the wrong idea about who was anxious. He walked out to the front of the house. Evelyn was already on the porch. She was standing at the top of the steps with her arms at her sides, and her face in the expression Luke had come to recognize in the week since his return. The one that was not quite neutral and not quite ready, like a person who had been expecting a particular conversation for a long time and had made their peace with having it. Drake was exactly what Luke would have built if someone had asked him to construct a man from the idea of comfortable dishonesty. I was perhaps 55 with the kind of weight that came from good meals and no physical labor, and a face that had learned over decades how to arrange itself into whatever expression the moment seemed to call for. Right now it was calling for something that wanted to look like reasonableness. The man behind him, the lawyer, presumably, was younger, thin, with a bag that did indeed look like the kind lawyers carried, and the expression of a man being paid to be somewhere he would not otherwise choose to be. Drake stopped at the base of the porch steps and looked up at Evelyn first. Then he looked at Luke, and something moved in his face that he covered quickly. Surprise, maybe. He hadn't known Luke was back. Good, Luke thought. Let him recalculate. "Mr. Callahan," Drake said, extending his hand. "Calvin Drake, Harlan County Agricultural Bank. I don't believe we've had the pleasure." Luke looked at the hand for a half-second before shaking it. Long enough for Drake to notice, short enough to be deniable. "Mr. Drake," he said, "I'd heard you were back." Drake's voice carried the particular warmth of a man who has practiced warmth until it sounds almost real. "Wonderful news. Your father was a valued customer of ours for many years." "My father is dead," Luke said, "and you bought his debt at a discount and then redirected his son's payments into your own account for 18 months. So I'd appreciate it if we skipped the part where we pretend to like each other." Drake's expression flickered. He recovered it quickly. He was good at that. But Luke had seen it, and from the corner of his eye he caught Evelyn turning her head very slightly toward him with something that might have been reassessment. "I understand there may be some confusion about the account management during a difficult transitional period," Drake said, with the smoothness of someone who had prepared this sentence ahead of time. "That's actually part of what I'm here to address. There are some financial and legal matters regarding the property that I believe deserve a frank discussion." "Then be frank," Luke said. Drake glanced at Evelyn. "Perhaps somewhere more private." "Mrs. Mercer is a legal partner in this operation," Luke said. "Anything you have to say to me, you can say in front of her." Something tightened around Drake's eyes. Just briefly. "Of course," he said. He reached back and the lawyer put the bag in his hands with the practiced efficiency of a man whose job was to hand things to other men at the right moment. Drake opened it and produced a document, thick, official-looking,
with the kind of binding that suggested someone had spent money making it intimidating. He held it out. Luke took it. He didn't open it immediately. "What is it?" he asked. "A legal challenge," Drake said, "to the validity of the partnership filing made by Mrs. Mercer 22 months ago." He shifted his weight just slightly toward confidence. "Our legal team has identified several procedural irregularities in the original filing, specifically in the notification requirements that should have been met before a third-party partnership could be legally established on a property with outstanding bank debt." Evelyn said nothing. Luke could feel her stillness beside him the way you feel a wall, solid, not moving. "In plain terms," Drake continued, "the partnership Mrs. Mercer established was never legally valid.
It was filed without proper notification to the existing lion holder. That's the bank, that's me, which is a requirement under county property law for any third-party arrangement on an encumbered property." He smiled, which was the most dishonest thing he'd done yet. "I'm not here to cause trouble, Mr. Callahan. I'm here to give you the opportunity to resolve this cleanly. Sign over the property in an agreed transfer, we'll settle the remaining debt, and everyone walks away without the expense and unpleasantness of a lengthy court case." The yard was very quiet. Somewhere on the south pasture, cattle moved. Wind came off the ridge and pushed at the hem of Evelyn's dress and went away again. Luke looked at the document in his hands. He didn't open it. He looked at Drake. "When did you file this challenge?" he asked. "The petition was submitted to the county court on Monday morning," Drake said. "Monday. 2 days ago." Luke had been at the south well on Monday morning, fixing the secondary pump casing with Reuben. It had been ordinary. He hadn't known anything had been filed. "Mr. Callahan," Drake said, and now there was something different in his voice. Not the warmth, but the thing underneath the warmth, which was considerably less pleasant. "I want to be direct with you, man to man. Whatever arrangement you've come to with this woman, it doesn't change the legal reality of what I'm holding. A partnership that was never valid leaves you holding the full debt on a property whose title is, let's call it complicated. The bank's position is strong. My legal team is thorough." He glanced at Evelyn again with an expression that was almost pity and was entirely calculated. "I'd hate to see you lose what's left of your family's land over a bad filing by someone who meant well but didn't know what they were doing." Luke stood very still. There were a number of things he could have said at that moment. He chose the one that was truest. "I'd like you to wait right here," he said. He went inside. He was back in 4 minutes. When he came out, he had a folder in his hand, brown cardboard, worn at the corners, with the Harlan County seal visible on the top document. He'd gotten it from the county courthouse the previous Friday, the morning after Hatch had warned him about Drake by the south gate. He hadn't told Evelyn he'd gone. He hadn't told anyone. He'd ridden into town before sunrise, been there when the recorder's office opened, and spent 2 hours with the documents before the clerk helped him locate what he needed and had copies certified. He hadn't known exactly what he was looking for. He'd known he was looking for something, because a man like Drake didn't wait 2 years and do nothing. A man like Drake planned, and planning left records, and records lived in county offices where they were available to anyone willing to wake up early and ask politely. He descended the porch steps and stopped in front of Drake and held the folder out. Drake took it with the expression of a man who didn't know what he was holding yet. He opened it. He read the first page, and Luke watched something happen in his face that Drake was not skilled enough to conceal entirely. A contraction, like a man who has reached for something and found it not where he expected. "What is this?" Drake said, but his voice had lost some of its architecture. "The original partnership filing," Luke said, "with the certified receipt from the county recorder showing the notification was delivered to your bank's registered office 6 days before the filing was completed." He paused. "Not the notification to your personal office, which you apparently didn't pass along to your own legal team. The notification to the bank's registered address, which is the address specified in the lien agreement, which is the address required by county property law." He let that sit for a second. "The notification your legal team told you didn't exist." Drake stared at the document. "The irregularity in the filing," Luke continued, "isn't in the filing. It's in the fact that your bank received proper notification and you chose not to act on it within the statutory response window, which forfeited your right to object." He kept his voice even. He had practiced this on the ride back from the courthouse on Friday. "What your legal team has filed with the county court is a challenge based on the absence of a notification they haven't looked for in the right place because you didn't tell them where to look." The lawyer had moved up beside Drake and was reading over his shoulder, and the color had left the younger man's face in a way that suggested he was doing rapid professional calculations about what his name on that Monday filing now meant. Drake looked up from the folder. The warmth was gone entirely now. "Where did you get these?" he said. "County courthouse," Luke said. "Public record. Available to anyone who asks." He held Drake's gaze. "I asked." The silence stretched. It had a quality to it that was different from the earlier silence. This one had weight, the weight of a thing collapsing that had been held up by the wrong kind of support. Hatch had come around from the barn. Reuben was near the fence. Pete was standing near the equipment shed trying to look like he was doing something else. Gordy had appeared from somewhere and was leaning on the water trough with his arms folded, giving Drake the slow, patient look of a very large man who had nothing urgent to do. Tom Stills was standing at the bunkhouse door with his hat in his hands. Drake looked around at all of them with the expression of a man recalculating odds that had just shifted considerably. "I'd strongly advise your legal team," Luke said, "to withdraw the petition before Thursday. After Thursday, it becomes a matter of public record that the bank filed a fraudulent challenge on a property with a valid legal partnership, which is a different kind of problem than the one you came here to create." "You can't prove intent," Drake said, and his voice had gone flat and cold in a way that was, Luke thought, probably closer to the real man than anything else he'd heard that morning. "I can't," Luke agreed, "but the certified dates on those documents can, and they'll be very interesting to a county judge, especially one who's been watching a particular bank acquire foreclosed properties for 5 years. He paused. "I'm going to ask you to leave my property now, Mr. Drake, and I'd ask that you not come back without going through a lawyer first, one who's seen all the documents." For a long moment, Drake didn't move. I was the kind of man who had not heard no frequently enough for it to sit comfortably, and he was trying, Luke could see, to locate some ground that hadn't just given way beneath him. He looked at Evelyn once more, and whatever he found in her face when she looked back at him, it wasn't what he was looking for. He handed the folder back. Luke didn't take it. "Keep it," Luke said. "Show your lawyer." Drake passed it to the man behind him, who took it with the careful movements of someone handling something that might be evidence. Then Drake turned and walked back to his wagon, and the lawyer followed, and neither of them said anything until they were past the gate. Nobody in the yard spoke until the sound of the wagon was gone down the road. Then Pete, who had been holding his breath for what seemed like several minutes, let it out audibly enough to make Gordy look over at him. Reuben turned toward the barn. Gordy pushed off from the water trough. Hatch looked at Luke for a long moment, nodded once. The nod of a man who has just seen something he expected and is satisfied to have his expectation confirmed, and went back to whatever he'd been doing. Tom Stills disappeared into the bunkhouse. Luke turned around. Evelyn was still standing on the porch. She hadn't moved since Drake arrived. She was looking at Luke with an expression he hadn't seen on her yet, and it took him a moment to identify it because it was not something she wore often or comfortably. It was the expression of someone who has been holding up their own weight for so long that the sudden presence of support from an unexpected direction is disorienting rather than simply relieving. "You went to the courthouse on Friday," she said. "Yes." "Before sunrise. The recorder's office opens early." She was quiet for a moment. "You didn't tell me." "No," he said. He came up the steps and stopped on the same level as her. "I wasn't sure what I'd find. I didn't want to—" He paused, looking for honest words. "Raise something and then not be able to deliver it." Evelyn looked at him. There was something happening behind her eyes that she was not quite managing to contain with her usual composure, and she seemed to be aware of this, which made it more visible, which was a very human kind of problem. "What made you go?" she asked. "Hatch told you Drake would come back, but you didn't have to go looking." Luke considered this. He'd thought about it himself on the ride home Friday, watching the road unroll in front of Cedar in the cold early morning. "Because you kept records," he said finally. "You kept records of everything you did, every decision, every mistake, every dollar, so that when I came back I could know everything you knew." He paused. "Seemed like the least I could do was learn the same thing about what was coming." She looked at him for a long moment. Her jaw worked once, the way it did when she was processing something she hadn't expected and was determining how to carry it. Then she looked away, out over the yard, and her voice when she spoke was carefully even. I was ready to fight it in court, she said. I had the same documents. I just didn't. I was going to wait until he filed and then respond. Responding is slower, Luke said. Yes, she said. It is. And you were going to do it alone. She didn't answer that directly. I've been doing most things alone for a while. I know, he said. That's over. She looked back at him then, sharply enough that it told him something, like the sentence had arrived with more force than he'd intended, or more than she'd been prepared for. He didn't walk it back. Inside, Evelyn made coffee. She always made coffee when she needed something to do with her hands. He'd noticed that. And Luke sat at the kitchen table and opened the document Drake had brought and read it properly for the first time. It was, as he'd told Drake, built on a false premise. The notification question was its entire foundation. Without that, the rest of it was elaborate wallpaper. But the work that had gone into it was real. 3 weeks of legal preparation at least, probably more. Drake had been building this while Luke was still on the trail. He'd been building it before Luke came back. He'd been building it against Evelyn alone. Luke set the document on the table. He's been planning this since at least before I got home, he said. Evelyn set a cup down in front of him and took the chair across from his. She looked at the document without touching it. Since spring, she said. I noticed there was a man asking questions in town around April, at the land office, about ownership records. I didn't know who he was then. Did you report it? To whom? She said, without bitterness. Just the practical observation of someone who had accurately assessed the available options. The county sheriff is not Drake's friend, but he's not particularly interested in a widow's legal concerns either. The lawyer I used for the original filing is in Cheyenne. I wrote to him. He said to let him know if anything was filed. She paused. I was watching. I just didn't find what you found. You would have, Luke said, given time. Maybe, she said, but time is what he was counting on me not having. That was true. Drake's strategy had depended on speed. File the challenge, arrive in person before there was time to respond, present the pressure of a court action and the offer of an exit simultaneously, and count on a woman alone managing a large property to take the path of least resistance. It was the strategy of a man who had done it before. The previous partnership disputes Hatch had mentioned, Luke thought about those now with a cold, specific anger he was careful to keep out of his voice. Those other partnerships, he said, the ones that ended badly. Do you know what happened to them? Evelyn was quiet for a moment. One of them, she said carefully, was a woman named Clara Foss. She came to the county about 7 years ago. She had a partial share in a property east of here, similar arrangement. Drake challenged her legal standing. She settled out of court after about 4 months. She paused. She sold her share for about 1/3 of what she'd put in and left the county. And the other? A man named Webb. He had a different situation. He'd gone into partnership with Drake voluntarily, not knowing who he was, essentially. When the arrangement turned bad, he tried to fight it. He was in court for 2 years. He won, technically. She paused again. He left anyway. The legal costs took everything he'd won. Luke picked up his coffee. So he either wears you down in court or pressures you into a bad settlement, he said. That's been the pattern, Evelyn said. He's patient. He can afford to be. And he picks situations where the other party is already under strain. She met Luke's eyes. A ranch with outstanding debt and an absent owner looked like exactly his kind of opportunity. Except someone came and sat at the desk, Luke said. The ghost of something passed across her face. Except that, she agreed. They sat with the coffee and the document between them and the kitchen quiet around them. And Luke thought about Clara Foss leaving with 1/3 of what she'd put in and going somewhere else. And thought about what the Bar W would look like right now if Evelyn Mercer had not walked into the county recorder's office 22 months ago with a lawyer from Cheyenne and her late husband's inheritance. He thought about his father's desk, which still smelled faintly of pipe tobacco even after 2 years, and the ledger in the drawer, and the yellow curtains on the kitchen window. He'll try again, Luke said. What we did today, it closed one door. It doesn't close all of them. No, Evelyn agreed. The debt is still real. The amount he had redirected, even if we can prove the redirecting, fighting it costs money we'd have to pull from operations. He was thinking out loud, which was something he didn't usually do. He did it now because she would follow it, and because her thinking was worth having. He could come back at the debt itself, find a different legal angle. He could, Evelyn said, but the certified notification documents you found today don't just protect the partnership filing. They also document that the bank received proper notice and sat on it, which reflects on the bank's handling of the account overall. She was looking at a spot on the table while she thought the way she did. If you take those documents to a lawyer and file your own complaint about the payment redirections, you put him in a position where he's defending himself instead of attacking us. Luke looked at her. Attack the account handling, she said. Use what you found. Make him explain to a county judge how payments sent to a registered county address ended up in an account he controlled, and why the principal balance doubled during the period when payments were being received. She paused. He doesn't want that examination any more than we wanted his petition. Luke was quiet for a moment. You'd thought of this already, he said. She said nothing, which was answer enough. Why didn't you do it? He asked. She looked up from the table. Because I was a widow with a legal partnership and a foreign inheritance in a county where I'd been for less than 2 years, she said. A complaint like that, if it failed, would give him ammunition. I needed, she paused, choosing the word, standing. Someone whose name on the complaint carried more weight than mine did here. My name, Luke said. Your name, she said, and your presence. A man who came back to his family's land and found evidence of bank fraud is a different kind of plaintiff than a woman who bought in from outside. Luke looked at her for a long moment. You've been waiting for me, he said. Not accusingly, just as a fact. She held his gaze. I've been managing without you, she said. That's not the same thing. She paused. But yes, there were things I could do alone and things I couldn't. I knew the difference. He sat with that. Outside, the afternoon was going flat and cold, the light losing its angle. Through the kitchen window, he could see Pete crossing the yard toward the barn with a bucket, and the smoke from the bunkhouse chimney moving sideways in the wind. This was the place he had ridden away from 2 years ago, believing he might lose. This was the place he had sent money to across 700 days with nothing but arithmetic and stubbornness holding the prayer together. It was still here. It was more than still here. And the person who had kept it was sitting across a kitchen table from him, explaining how to fight the man who had tried to take it, in the tone of someone who had been thinking about this particular chess match for months and was ready to play. He thought about what Hatch had said, that Drake would try to separate them, work on each piece separately. He thought about what Drake had done to Clara Foss, who had been alone. He picked you, Luke said, because he thought you were alone. Yes, Evelyn said. He was wrong about that, Luke said, as of this week. She looked at him steadily. Something moved in her expression. Not relief exactly, but the slow release of something that had been held tightly for a very long time and was only now, carefully, being let go. As of this week, she said. Luke reached across the table and picked up Drake's document. He stood, walked to the stove, opened the door, and put the document inside. The paper caught immediately and burned orange and then blue and then was gone. Evelyn watched this from her chair. That was the only copy he gave us, she said. He has more, Luke said. He always has more. He closed the stove door. But he's going to think about this afternoon for a while before he decides how to use them. He went to the window and looked out at the yard and the pasture beyond, and cedar near the south fence eating in the evening light, and the solid new post in the corner of the fence line that had been rotted when he left and had been pulled and reset in January, while he was somewhere on the Texas Panhandle not knowing any of this was happening. He heard Evelyn push back from the table behind him. He heard her begin to clear the cups. Luke, she said. He turned. Thank you, she said. It was simple and direct and carried the weight of someone who did not say it often or lightly. He nodded. He didn't say you're welcome because you're welcome implied she'd asked for a favor, and what had happened today was not a favor. I wasn't sure yet what it was. He knew it was something that had changed the shape of things, though he couldn't have told you precisely how. He put on his coat and went out to do the evening rounds, and the cold air was clean on his face, and above the ridge the first stars were coming out in a sky that had finally decided to clear. Behind him, through the kitchen window, he could see the lamp lit and the yellow curtains, and the shape of a woman moving with complete assurance through a kitchen she had built back up from nothing, in a house she had kept alive for a man she'd never met, in a county that had tried its level best to make her feel like she didn't belong. She was still here. They both were. And Calvin Drake, driving back down the road to Harlan in the cold dark, had a folder of documents in his lawyer's bag that told him, if he was smart enough to read them correctly, that the particular opportunity he had been counting on was considerably more complicated than it had appeared. Whether he was smart enough to leave it alone was a different question, and Luke Callahan, walking his fence line in the last of the daylight, was under no illusion that the answer was yes. But tonight the cattle were fed, and the fences were solid, and the lamp was on in the kitchen window. Tonight, that was enough. Drake withdrew the petition on Thursday morning. Luke found out from Hatch, who had heard it from the county recorder's clerk, who had apparently told half of Harlan by noon. The withdrawal was filed quietly, without explanation. Just a one-line document that said the petitioner was withdrawing the challenge pending further review of supporting materials. The lawyer's name was on it. Drake's wasn't, which told Luke something about how Drake was positioning himself for whatever came next. A man who kept his name off the retreat was a man who was already planning the next move. Luke told Evelyn at supper that evening. She listened, nodded, and passed him the bread without particular celebration, which was how he'd expected her to receive it. She had long since stopped expecting problems to resolve themselves cleanly. The withdrawal was one door closing. It didn't change what was behind the others. "We need to file the complaint," she said, "about the payment redirections." "I know," Luke said. "I wrote to the lawyer in Cheyenne this morning." She looked at him. He'd done it before telling her, which he recognized was something he should probably have reversed. She didn't say that, but she looked it, just briefly, before returning to her plate. "His name is Alderman," she said. "Arthur Alderman. He's thorough and he's honest, and he costs more than he should." "How much do we have in the operating account?" "Enough for a retainer," she said. "Not enough for a long fight." "Then we need to make the fight short," Luke said. She didn't argue with this. They ate the rest of the meal in the comfortable silence that had developed between them over the past week and a half. Not the silence of people who had nothing to say, but the silence of people who had learned that not everything needed to be said immediately, and that shared space could be quiet without being empty. That evening, Luke went through the ledger again. Not the financial records this time, but the decision log at the back. The personal accounting Evelyn had kept of everything she'd done and why. He read it more slowly this time than he had the first night, when he'd been exhausted and overwhelmed and reading too fast to absorb it properly. There was an entry from 14 months ago, February of the previous year. It was longer than the others and written in a slightly different hand, not shaky, but with the particular quality of writing done when the writer was tired and keeping themselves upright through will alone. It described a 3-day period in which 2 of the cows had developed symptoms of a respiratory illness that Evelyn had feared was contagious, and she'd had to make the decision to isolate the herd without being entirely certain whether isolation or treatment was the right call, because the nearest veterinarian was 2 days' ride and the weather had closed the road. She'd chosen isolation. She'd treated the 2 sick animals herself, following instructions from a veterinary manual she'd ordered the previous fall. Apparently she'd anticipated needing it, which was itself something. And she'd watched the herd for 5 days straight, sleeping in the barn the first 2 nights. Both animals recovered. The herd had stayed clean. At the bottom of the entry, in smaller letters that felt like they'd been added later. Made the wrong call on the isolation method at first. Switched protocols on day 2. Should have known the Boughton method from the start, but didn't read far enough ahead. Both animals survived regardless, but the error was mine. Luke sat with that entry for a long time. Most people, when they wrote their own records, found ways to narrate their mistakes toward being understandable. Evelyn had just written what she'd done wrong, in plain language, and left it there. He closed the ledger and sat in the dark office for a while. He was developing a problem he hadn't anticipated when he rode back into Harlan County. The problem was not the banker, and it was not the debt, and it was not even the slow, enormous work of understanding everything that had changed about his own land while he'd been away. The problem was quieter than any of that and considerably less manageable. It was the yellow curtains. It was the fence post she'd reset in January. It was the veterinary manual she'd ordered in the fall because she thought she might need it. It was her handwriting at the bottom of a ledger entry at 2 a.m, admitting she'd read the wrong chapter. It was Cedar following her across the pasture with the devotion of an animal who knew a good person on instinct. Luke Callahan had spent 2 years on cattle drives, telling himself that when he got home, everything would make sense again. He would fix what was broken, pay what was owed, and get back to the simple arithmetic of running a ranch. He had not factored in the possibility that someone would have already fixed most of it, and that the person who'd done the fixing would be the most confusing thing he'd encountered in 700 days. He went to bed and stared at the ceiling for an hour before sleeping. The letter from Arthur Alderman arrived 9 days later. It was thorough. Evelyn had been right about him, and it confirmed what Luke had suspected. The documentation he'd recovered from the county courthouse, combined with the bank's own account records that Alderman had obtained through a formal legal request, constituted strong grounds for a formal complaint of fraudulent account management against Harlan County Agricultural Bank and its principal, Calvin Drake. Alderman's assessment was precise. The payment redirections were documented in bank records in a way that Drake had apparently assumed would never be examined, because the examination required simultaneous access to both the county property records and the bank's internal ledger, which was normally only possible through formal legal channels that required a pending complaint to access. Drake had built a system that protected itself by assuming no one would ever formally challenge it. The circular logic of it was, Alderman wrote with what Luke read as restrained professional outrage, remarkable in its audacity. Luke read the letter twice. Then he walked it out to the barn where Evelyn was checking the early calf. The small one, the premature one, who had continued to gain weight and now stood without assistance, and had developed the particular boldness of young animals who have been handled by humans during vulnerable periods and have concluded that humans are mostly benign. And he handed her the letter. She read it. She read it again. She handed it back. "We should file," she said. "Yes," he said. "Alderman says 6 to 8 weeks for a hearing." "I know." "Drake will countersue," she said. "It's what he does. He'll make it as expensive and slow as possible." "I know that too." She looked at him. "And?" "And I've thought about it," Luke said. "Drake has been doing this for 5 years. Clara Foss is somewhere out there with a third of what she started with. That man Webb spent 2 years in court and left anyway. Somebody is going to have to be the one who doesn't leave." He paused. "I have his name on a bank account record showing redirected payments from my father's estate. That's not a complicated story for a judge." Evelyn was quiet for a moment. She was stroking the calf's neck without seeming to notice she was doing it. "It's a simple story," she said. "Simple stories still cost money to tell in court." "Yes," Luke said. "But this one also cost Drake money to fight, and Drake doesn't like spending money he wasn't planning to spend." He looked at her. His withdrawal on Thursday wasn't just strategy. He recalculated the expense. If we file the complaint, he has to defend it or settle it, and either one costs him more than a quiet withdrawal. She considered this. He'd seen her do this before, not the quick assessment of an impulsive person, but the slower evaluation of someone who had learned to count all the costs before moving, because she'd been the one who had to cover them. "All right," she said, "file it." "I already told Alderman to proceed," Luke said. "This morning." The beat of silence that followed was not quite the same as the earlier ones. "You told him before asking me," she said. "It was even. Not angry. Just naming a thing." "I told him contingent on your agreement," Luke said. "I told him we'd confirm by Friday." "Today is Wednesday." "Yes." She looked at him for another moment, then looked back at the calf. "Then tell him yes on Friday," she said. "After you've told me first." "Fair," Luke said. "Yes," she said. "It is." He left her with the calf and walked back to the house, and he thought, not for the first time and increasingly with a clarity that was becoming difficult to ignore, that working alongside Evelyn Mercer required a quality of attention he was not entirely used to applying to other people. Not because she demanded it, because she had earned it, and she was right when she corrected him, and being right was its own kind of claim on a person's regard. The following week brought practical problems that crowded out the legal ones, which Luke was privately grateful for because practical problems had solutions you could work with your hands. The north pasture fence, different section from the one Hatch maintained, the older original run along the property line, had a post failure that took down 20 feet of wire. 3 steers got through the gap before anyone noticed, and were found 2 miles north on the neighboring Briggs land, which was a mercy since the Briggs family were decent people who returned them without incident and didn't charge for the inconvenience. But fixing the fence meant buying post lumber, which meant a trip to town, which meant Luke and Evelyn went together in the wagon because she needed to pick up the supply order she'd placed the week before, and there was no practical reason to make two trips. It was the first time they'd been off the ranch property together. Luke noticed this without quite deciding what to do with the noticing.
Harlan was a town of maybe 1,200 people, big enough to have a proper main street with a bank and a land office and a general store and a feed merchant, small enough that everyone on that main street watched the Bar W wagon come through with the particular focused attention of a community that had been following the situation for 22 months and was now updating its information in real time. Luke was aware of this in the way you're aware of weather. It was present, it had effects. You couldn't do much about it except keep moving. Evelyn was aware of it more specifically. He could tell by the way she sat in the wagon. Not differently than usual, not stiffly, but with a precision of posture that told him she'd learned exactly how much attention she attracted in this town, and had made her peace with it without ever finding it comfortable. At the feed merchant, a man named Dolan, who had the weathered face of someone who'd been in the same store for 30 years and expected to be there for 30 more, greeted Evelyn by name and shook Luke's hand and said he was glad the Bar W was still in good hands. He said it looking at both of them equally, which Luke noted. At the lumber yard, the transaction was quick and straightforward. The man behind the counter gave Luke the price for the post lumber and then said, almost casually, "You know Drake's been asking around about land values east of your property?" Luke kept his expression easy. "That so?" "Past few weeks," the man said, "asking about the Henderson's place and the old Mabry lot." He stacked the receipt on the counter. "Just thought you'd want to know, considering." "I appreciate it," Lucas said. In the wagon, heading back, Evelyn said, "He's looking at the land adjacent to the Bar W." "I heard. If he acquires the Henderson's place and the Mabry lot, he controls access to the North water source," she said. "We use that tributary in dry summers." "I know," Luke said. He'd known the land around the Bar W since he was a boy. The North tributary came off the ridge and crossed 3 properties before it reached the Bar W's boundary: the Hendersons, the old Mabry lot, and a strip of county land that was theoretically available for appropriation. If Drake bought the first 2, he could, under Wyoming water law, file for usage rights that would technically supersede the Bar W's historical access. "He's not finished," Evelyn said. "No," Luke agreed. "He's moved the attack." She was quiet for a moment, watching the road. "The Hendersons are struggling," she said. "Their cattle numbers are down and their eldest son left last spring. I've talked to Helen Henderson at church, at the community meetings," she corrected seamlessly, "and she said they've had 2 bad seasons in a row." Luke looked at her. "You've been watching this." "I've been watching everything," she said. It wasn't pride. It was just what she did. "The Mabry lot is empty," Luke said. "Has been for 4 years. The estate is unresolved. Heirs in Ohio who can't agree on anything." She paused. "A county judge could approve a sale without full heir consensus under certain conditions. Drake would know those conditions." Luke held the reins loosely, letting Cedar find her pace on the familiar road. The afternoon had gone flat and cold again, and the ridge north of the property was dark with coming weather. He did the math on water rights and adjacent land and a banker who had just been pushed back and would be looking for the next angle, and the math came out to a number he didn't like. "We need to talk to the Hendersons," he said. "Before Drake does," Evelyn said. "Before Drake does," he confirmed. They went the next morning. The Henderson place was 4 miles north, smaller than the Bar W, in the particular condition of a ranch where the people were working as hard as they ever had, and still falling behind because the margin had gotten too thin. Jim Henderson was a man in his late 50s, the kind of tired that goes into the bones. His wife Helen was quieter than her husband, but sharper, with the watchful eyes of a woman who had been managing the actual arithmetic of the operation for years, while her husband managed the physical work. Luke let Evelyn lead the conversation, partly because she already knew these people, and partly because he had learned, was still learning, adding to a list that grew daily, that Evelyn Mercer was considerably better at conversations that required trust than he was. She was honest with them. She told them about Drake's pattern with adjacent properties, about the water rights calculation, about what Drake had tried with the Bar W and what Luke had found at the courthouse. She didn't oversell or dramatize. She laid it out the way she laid out everything, plainly, with the numbers visible.
Helen Henderson listened to all of it with the careful attention of a woman absorbing bad news she'd suspected was coming. When Evelyn finished, Helen looked at her husband, who was looking at the table. "He came out 3 weeks ago," Jim said, finally. "Offered us a price. Wasn't much, but it was—" He stopped. "We're not in a position to be particular." "What was the offer?" Luke asked. Jim told him. It was low. Not insultingly. So, Drake was too smart for that, but low in the specific way of an offer made to people who can't easily say no. Luke and Evelyn looked at each other, and the look was a conversation that didn't require words because they'd been thinking together for nearly 2 weeks now and had developed, with the efficiency of people who worked alongside each other in practical conditions, a shorthand. "We can beat it," Luke said to Jim. "Not by much, but we can beat it, and we can close it properly, with a deed that goes to your heirs and a water access agreement that protects both properties." He paused. "I'd need a month." Jim Henderson looked at him. Helen Henderson looked at Evelyn. "Why?" Jim asked. It was a fair question and deserved a straight answer. "Because if Drake gets your land, he gets the tributary access, and he can make our summers very difficult," Luke said. "And because your family's been in this county for as long as ours has, and I'd rather see your deed go to your children than to a bank that's going to parcel it off." It wasn't elegant. It was true, which was better. Jim said he'd think on it. Helen said they'd talk that evening and send word. Luke and Evelyn drove back to the Bar W in the thin afternoon light, and Luke was aware, not for the first time, that they were doing something that had stopped being separate interests at some point he couldn't precisely locate. That the ranch's defense and Evelyn's position and the water rights and the Hendersons and Calvin Drake had all woven together into something that was harder to pick apart than it had been the morning he rode up the lane and found a stranger on his porch. Hatch was in the yard when they got back, with the look on his face he got when he had news he wasn't sure how to deliver. "Letter came while you were gone," he said. He held it out. "County court seal." Luke took it and opened it standing in the yard while Evelyn watched from the wagon seat. He read it once, then again. "Alderman's complaint generated a response," he said. "Drake's filed a counter-complaint. Fraud against Mrs. Mercer. He's claiming she used false documentation to establish the partnership." The yard was very quiet. Evelyn stepped down from the wagon. She held out her hand for the letter, and Luke gave it to her. She read it. Her face did not change in any visible way, but her breathing did, just slightly, a slowing, like a person taking stock. "The documentation wasn't false," she said. Her voice was completely level. "I know that," Luke said. "Alderman has certified copies of everything." "I know." "This is designed to slow the main complaint down," she said. "Make us respond to this before our case proceeds. It's a delay tactic." "Yes," Luke said. "And it's going to work for a while because we have to respond." He watched her face. "Are you all right?" She looked up from the letter. The question had landed differently than he'd intended, more direct, more personal. And for a moment her composure did a thing it rarely did, which was show the seam, just briefly, just enough. "I'm tired," she said, simply, honestly, without dressing it up. "I'm tired of defending something I did correctly." "I know," he said. "I didn't use false documents," she said. "I was careful about every single piece of it because I knew—" She stopped. "I knew someone might challenge it eventually. I was careful." "You were," he said, "and we can prove it." She folded the letter and handed it back. She was herself again, composed, forward-looking, already moving from feeling the hit to calculating the response. But he had seen the seam, and he did not forget it, and he filed it alongside the ledger entry written at 2 a.m, and the way she'd looked walking back from the flooded pasture and the 10 minutes in the barn she'd mentioned. She was not made of stone. She had just learned to stand anyway, which was considerably more impressive. He sent word to Alderman that afternoon. The counter-complaint required a formal response within 20 days, and Alderman would need to begin immediately. The cost of it was going to cut into the operating account in a way that made Luke's jaw tight when he did the arithmetic, but there was no path around it, and the only thing worse than fighting on Drake's ground would be not fighting. That evening, after supper, Luke went out to the south pasture and stood at the fence in the dark for a while, the way he'd started doing since he came back. a kind of informal accounting at the end of the day, standing in the cold and looking at the land and running the numbers and the questions and the problems through his mind until they settled into some kind of manageable order. He heard her come up behind him before she spoke. He'd learned her footsteps, quick and even, no wasted movement, the way you learn the sounds of a place you live in long enough. "You don't have to stand out here alone every night," she said. "Habit," he said. She came and stood at the fence beside him, not close enough to be presumptuous, just present. "The cattle are good," she said, looking at the dark pasture. "They are," he said. "We have enough hay for the winter if the season's normal." "I know. The calf gained weight again today. Gordy told me." They were quiet for a moment. The stars were out. The sky had cleared after its days of clouds, and the ridge north of the property was a dark line against the lighter dark of the sky. "Why did you really go to the courthouse?" she asked. "The morning after Hatch warned you, before sunrise." He'd expected this question. He'd expected it for days, actually, and had been somewhat surprised it hadn't come sooner. "Because of what you said in the kitchen," he said. "That first evening, about why you filed the partnership." He paused. "You said you didn't want to be the person who watched and did nothing." She was quiet, listening. "I'd been doing that," he said, "for 2 years, sending money and not knowing what was happening here and telling myself I was doing what I could." He looked at the dark pasture. "And I was, mostly. But watching what you built here, reading that ledger, I understood something I hadn't understood clearly before, which is that there's a difference between doing what you can from a distance and actually being in the problem." He paused. "You were in the problem, from the first day you were in it all the way. I thought I could catch up by reading a ledger, but I couldn't catch up until I did something." "So you went to the courthouse," she said. "So I went to the courthouse," he said. She was quiet for a moment. The wind moved across the pasture and came back again. "For the record," she said, "you caught up faster than I expected." He looked at her. In the dark, he could see the line of her profile against the lighter sky, and Cedar moving in the far corner of the pasture and the lamp on in the bunkhouse window. "What did you expect?" he asked. "A man who'd been away for 2 years who came home and found a stranger running his ranch," she said. "I expected resentment, maybe anger. At minimum, a sustained period of not trusting anything I told him." She paused. "I did not expect someone who went to the courthouse at 4:30 in the morning the day after being warned. My father used to say that the people who get things done are the ones who are already awake when the problem starts," Luke said. "He sounds like he was right about that one," Evelyn said. "He was right about a lot of things," Luke said. "He just couldn't do arithmetic." She made a sound that was not quite a laugh but was in the same family. It was the first time he'd heard anything close to it, and it landed in his chest somewhere it had no particular business being. He was quiet for a moment. "Evelyn," he said. "Yes." "This place?" He stopped. He started again. "I came home expecting to find something broken that I had to fix. And instead I found—" He paused, looking for honest words in the dark. "I found something that was already being held together by someone who had no reason to hold it except that she thought it deserved the chance." She didn't respond immediately. He heard her breathe. "I think I need to ask you something," he said, "and I need you to answer it without the ledger and without the operating account and without any consideration of what's practical." "That's a significant request for me specifically," she said. "I know," he said. "That's why I'm asking." She turned to look at him. He could feel it more than see it in the dark. "Is this home?" he asked. "Not the partnership, not the investment. Is the Bar W home to you?" The question sat in the cold air between them for what felt like a long time. "Yes," she said finally. Not quickly, not automatically. The yes of a person who had checked the answer carefully before giving it, and found it true. "I stopped thinking of it as someone else's ranch a long time ago. I don't know exactly when. Sometime during the first winter, I think, after the blizzard." She paused. "I know it's not mine in the way it's yours. I understand the difference." "Maybe the difference is smaller than you think," Luke said. She looked at him. In the dark, in the cold, on the fence line of a ranch that had nearly been lost and had been kept by stubbornness and courage and 22 months of work that should have broken a person and hadn't, Evelyn Mercer looked at Luke Callahan and said nothing, because some things are large enough that words have to wait for them. He didn't push.
He wasn't ready to push. There were still counter-complaints to answer, and water rights to protect, and a banker who hadn't finished, and a Henderson deed to negotiate, and 100 practical things that needed doing before the larger ones could be said plainly. But he had said what he'd said, and she had said what she'd said, and the cold air between them carried both things. He pushed off from the fence. "I'll do the morning rounds at 5, he said. "I'll make coffee," she said. He walked back toward the house. At the porch he turned, out of some instinct he didn't examine, and looked back toward the fence. She was still there, standing in the dark with her hands at the fence rail, looking out at the pasture, at the cattle moving slowly in the starlight, at the land she had fought for and lost sleep over and bled for and kept. His land. Her home. Somehow both things, and not as contradictory as they had seemed 2 weeks ago. He went inside. The lamp was on in the kitchen. The bread she'd made that morning was on the counter under a cloth. The ledger was on the desk where she'd left it. The curtains on the kitchen window were yellow in the lamplight, the same yellow his mother's had been. Luke Callahan stood in the kitchen of his father's house for a moment and let himself understand quietly and without drama that what he'd come home to was not what he'd left. It was better. He blew out the lamp and went to bed, and outside the Wyoming night settled over the Bar W and the cattle and the solid fences and the redug wells and the new shingles on the roof, and somewhere on the south pasture cedar moved in the dark, and the stars over the ridge burned clear and cold and indifferent, and the ranch that had almost been lost held on into another night, the same as it had for 22 months, because someone had decided it deserved to. The letter from Arthur Alderman arrived on a Tuesday, 3 weeks after he'd filed the formal response to Drake's countercomplaint, and it was the kind of letter that changed the temperature of a room. Luke read it at the kitchen table while Evelyn stood at the stove, and he read it twice before he set it down and said, "Drake's bank has a state examiner coming in." Evelyn turned around. Alderman filed a copy of the payment redirection documentation with the Wyoming State Banking Commission 2 weeks ago, Luke said. Apparently he did it quietly without telling us, because he wanted to see if it generated movement before raising our expectations. He looked up from the letter. It generated movement. She crossed the kitchen and picked up the letter and read it herself. He watched her face while she read, the controlled face, the one that processed information before allowing expression, and saw the moment she reached the part that mattered, because something shifted in the set of her eyes. "A state examiner," she said. "Who has authority Drake's county contacts can't reach," Luke said, "and who operates independently of the local court." "This changes the complaint's position," she said. "Considerably," Luke said. She set the letter down. She stood very still for a moment in the way she did when she was absorbing something that was larger than what she'd been carrying expectation-wise, and Luke had learned to give her that moment rather than fill it with words. "Alderman should have told us he was filing with the commission," she said finally. "Yes," Luke agreed. "I'm going to tell him that." "I know you are." She looked at him. "You're not going to argue that the outcome justifies the method?" "The outcome might," he said. "But you're right that he should have told us. Both things can be true." He paused. "Write the letter. I'll co-sign it." She looked at him for a moment with the particular expression she got when he did something that met her standard without being asked, which was an expression he had worked out over 3 weeks of close proximity and the gradual, stubborn process of two independent people learning to function as something more than individual operators, meant more than it showed on the surface. She sat down across from him and pulled the letter back toward her and read it a third time, more slowly. "If the examiner's review confirms the redirection," she said, "Drake can't run a counter-complaint about my documentation. He'll be defending his own account practices to a state official. He won't have the capacity to fight both." "That's what Alderman thinks," Luke said, "and Alderman has been right about most things." "Most," she said, with a precision that meant she had not forgotten the commission filing. "Most," he agreed. Outside, Pete was crossing the yard with the morning feed bucket, and Gordy was somewhere behind the barn, and the ordinary sounds of a working morning moved around the house the way they did now. Not as background, but as evidence. Evidence that the place was alive and intended to stay that way. Jim Henderson sent word that same week. He and Helen had talked it through, and they would accept Luke's offer on the land transaction, the price Luke had proposed, with the water access agreement Evelyn had drafted that protected both properties' tributary rights regardless of who owned what in between.
The deed transfer would take 6 weeks to process through the county, but Jim had told Drake in writing that the property was no longer available, and Helen had told Luke, through the messenger who brought the word, that she slept better the night after that letter went out than she had in 6 months. Luke told Evelyn this at the south fence that evening, where they had taken to standing after supper on nights when the weather allowed. Not by arrangement, not even by conversation, just by the drift of two people who ended up in the same place at the end of a day because it had become the place they went. Helen said that, Evelyn said. Word for word, Luke said. She was quiet for a moment. Good, she said simply. But there was something in the single word that carried the weight of a person who knew what it was to lose sleep over things you couldn't fully control, and who understood exactly what Helen Henderson's relief meant. The state examiner arrived in Harlan 12 days later. His name was Caldwell, and he was a compact, humorless man from Cheyenne who appeared to have no interest in local politics or social dynamics, and a great deal of interest in accurate numbers. He spent 4 days at the bank's offices. He requested access to 10 years of account records. He spoke to the county recorder. He requested copies of the documentation Luke had found at the courthouse, which Alderman provided, and he requested Evelyn's original partnership filing records, which she provided personally, clean, organized, and annotated in the same precise hand as the Bar W ledger. Luke did not meet with Caldwell. Alderman advised against it. The complaint spoke for itself, and Luke presenting himself at the examiner's office would look like pressure rather than confidence. He stayed on the ranch and worked and waited, which was the hardest kind of discipline because it looked from the outside like doing nothing. On the 4th day, Caldwell left Harlan without speaking to anyone at the Bar W. Alderman sent a note 2 days later saying that the examiner's preliminary report had been filed with the Banking Commission and that its contents were confidential pending formal review, but that based on the scope and duration of the examination, Alderman's professional assessment was that the commission had found something worth finding. Luke read this note at the kitchen table and did not celebrate, because celebration before the fact was the kind of thing that cost you later. He put the note in the folder with the rest of the documentation, added it to the growing stack that had been accumulating on his father's desk for a month, and went out to help Reuben with the drainage ditch on the East 40 that had started silting again. Evelyn, when he told her, said, "We wait." "We wait," he agreed. Waiting, it turned out, took 4 more weeks. They were 4 weeks in which the ranch moved through the business of late autumn. The hay stores inventoried and found adequate. The water tanks checked and maintained. The cattle rotated to the south pasture where the grass was holding better than expected. The premature calf, who had never been named because naming early animals was considered bad luck on most working ranches, but who had nonetheless been called the Little One by everyone including Luke with enough consistency that it functioned as a name, had grown to the point where Gordy pronounced her unlikely to die, which was the highest compliment a working cattleman typically offered. Luke and Evelyn worked together through those 4 weeks with the practical fluency of people who had stopped needing to explain themselves to each other on most things. He knew without asking which decisions she wanted to be consulted on, and which ones she expected him to handle. She knew without asking which mornings he needed to work alone and which ones he was thinking better in company. They disagreed twice, once about the timing of the second cattle rotation, which Luke thought was premature, and Evelyn thought was necessary given the north pasture grass condition. The grass condition proved her right within a week. Once about a purchase. Evelyn had authorized for new fencing materials at a price Luke thought was high, which turned out to be the last available stock before the merchant raised prices county-wide for the winter. She had known about the price increase and hadn't said so, which led to the most direct conversation they'd had yet. "You should have told me your reasoning," he said. "I should have," she said. "I made the call and I logged it in the ledger and I moved on. That's what I did when I was working alone." "You're not working alone anymore," he said. She looked at him steadily. "No," she said. "I'm aware of that. I'm still adjusting." "So am I," he said, which was true enough that saying it out loud surprised him slightly. She nodded once. "Then we're both adjusting," she said. "I'll explain my reasoning on the next one. And I'll ask before I assume," he said. They were not a perfect machine. They were two people with years of independent habit trying to build something together. And it was ungainly sometimes and occasionally frustrating, And neither of them was as patient as they wanted to be on days when the work was hard and the legal situation was pressing and the cold was coming down off the ridge with winter's particular lack of sympathy for human problems. But they kept working. And the work, as work tends to do when it's shared honestly, made them trust each other in the places where trust is built, which is not in the easy moments, but in the friction and the correction and the willingness to say, I should have told you, and mean it. The formal notice from the Wyoming State Banking Commission came on a Friday morning. Alderman's accompanying letter arrived the same day, which meant he'd known it was coming. Luke read both at the kitchen table. Evelyn sat across from him and waited. He finished and looked up. Calvin Drake has been issued a formal finding of account misconduct by the State Banking Commission, he said. The finding covers 11 accounts over 7 years, of which the Bar W debt account is 1. The bank is required to restore all misdirected payments to their proper accounts within 60 days and file corrected balance statements with the county recorder. He paused. The interest that was added to the Bar W balance during the period of redirection is voided. The actual remaining debt, recalculated on the original terms with correct payment credit, is... He paused again because the number was considerably smaller than anything Drake had ever put in front of them. Manageable. The kitchen was quiet. Drake personally? Evelyn asked. Referred to the county district attorney for review, Luke said, which means criminal charges are possible. Not certain, but possible. Evelyn sat with that. His counter-complaint against the partnership? She asked. Withdrawn, Luke said. Alderman says Drake's legal team filed the withdrawal yesterday, which is why Alderman knew the commission notice was coming. The timing tells the story. Drake pulled the counter-complaint because he knew the examiner's finding was about to make it untenable. She reached across the table and took the commission letter from him and read it herself. He let her read it completely. Outside, the morning was bright and cold, the kind of Wyoming winter morning that had no patience for sentiment but put a hard, clean light on everything it touched. When she finished, she set the letter down and pressed both hands flat on the table for a moment, not dramatically, just the gesture of a person returning to the physical world from somewhere inside their own head. It's done, she said. The legal part is done, Luke said. The debt is manageable. The partnership is uncontested. The Henderson deed goes through next month. He looked at her. It's done. She nodded slowly. Something moved across her face that was not the controlled expression and not the occasional flash of something under it. It was something else, something quieter and more difficult to name. The expression of a person arriving at the end of something very long and finding that the end looks different up close than it did from a distance. 22 months, she said, mostly to herself. 22 months, he agreed. She stood and went to the window and looked out at the yard and the pasture and the solid new fence posts and the cattle moving in the cold morning light. He let her look. After a while, she said, without turning around, I need to tell you something I haven't said directly. All right, he said. When I came here, she said, when I filed the partnership and started working the ranch, I told myself it was about the principle of the thing, that I didn't want to watch someone lose their land to a dishonest bank, that it was the right thing to do. She paused. And that was true, but it wasn't the whole truth. He waited. I needed somewhere to be, she said. After Martin died and his family made it clear that my presence in their world was conditional on his being in it, I needed somewhere that was just work and ground and problems I could actually solve. She turned around. The Bar W was that. I chose it somewhat at random because the problem was in front of me and I had the means, and it was the right thing to do. But I also chose it because I needed something to hold on to, and the ranch needed holding on to, and those two needs happened to coincide. She met his eyes. I wasn't purely selfless. I want you to know that. Luke looked at her for a long moment. I know, he said. You didn't... I knew a long time ago, he said. You told me the first night, actually. You said you needed somewhere to put your grief. You just said it in different words. He paused. It doesn't change anything about what you built here. The motive doesn't make the fence posts less solid. She looked at him. I thought it was important to say plainly. It was, he said. I'm glad you did. He stood up from the table. For what it's worth, I needed to come back somewhere worth coming back to. You gave me that. Whatever you needed to give it to me for, I'm not going to pretend that doesn't matter. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What do we do now?" And he understood that she was not asking about the debt or the legal situation or the Henderson deed. She was asking the larger question, the one that had been accumulating for 4 weeks of shared fence lines and evening conversations, and two people adjusting toward each other with the ungainly honesty of people who didn't know how to do it any other way. He crossed the kitchen. He stopped in front of her at a reasonable distance and looked at her directly because she was the kind of person who deserved to be looked at directly when something important was being said. "I'm not going on another drive," he said. "I'm done with that. I came home to run this ranch, and that's what I intend to do." He paused. "I'd like to do it with you, not because of the legal arrangement, not because of what you did while I was gone, although I'll spend a long time being grateful for it. Because you're the person I want to be working next to when something goes wrong. Because you're usually right, and you tell me when I'm wrong, and you don't make it harder than it needs to be. And because Cedar follows you around of her own free will, which I have always considered a reliable character reference." She made the sound again, the one that lived near a laugh. "That's not very romantic," she said. "No," he agreed, "but it's true. And I thought you'd prefer true." She looked at him for a moment that felt long and wasn't. "I do," she said. "Prefer true." "I know," he said. She reached up and took his hand, not dramatically, not with the gesture of a romantic scene, but the way you take someone's hand when you've made a decision and you want it acknowledged in the physical world. He held it. "I'm not easy to live with," she said. "I keep records of everything, and I wake up at 4:30, and I'll argue with you when I think you're wrong." "I know all of those things," he said. "I've been watching for a month." "And?" "And I wake up at 4:15, he said. "So the schedule isn't the problem." She laughed then, a real one, short and unguarded. And the sound of it in the kitchen of the Bar W house was something Luke Callahan would remember for the rest of his life, because it was the first time he'd heard it fully, and it was better than he'd expected, and he hadn't expected anything small. They were married that December in the front room of the ranch house, with Hatch standing beside Luke and Helen Henderson standing beside Evelyn, and every ranch hand crowded into the remaining space with the particular solemnity of working men attending something they understood the weight of. Pete cried, which he denied afterward, and which everyone politely agreed not to mention. Reuben brought a bottle of something from Mexico that he refused to identify and that solved the question of what to drink at the reception. Gordy gave a toast that was 4 words long. "About time," he said, and sat down, and received more agreement than most longer speeches. Tom Stills shook Luke's hand at the door on the way out and said, "Your father would have liked her." It was the best thing anyone said all evening, and Luke carried it home inside him like something to be kept. The winter was hard that year. Wyoming winters have no interest in symbolism or celebration, and the Bar W moved through it the same way it had moved through the previous 2 winters under Evelyn's management, which was to say with preparation and stubbornness, and the occasional setback absorbed without collapse. The north fence line went down in January during a blow that took out 3 posts, and Luke and Reuben and Pete spent a day in brutal cold repairing it. And Luke came in that evening unable to feel his left hand properly, and found Evelyn had left soup on the stove and a note on the table that said the east water tank needs checking tomorrow, and your gloves are inadequate. Get new ones, which was her version of being glad he was home. He got new gloves. She was right about those too. Drake, as it turned out, did not face criminal charges. The district attorney's review concluded that while the account management had been improper, the evidence of deliberate criminal intent was insufficient under the specific statutes applicable, which was the kind of outcome that felt inadequate, but was the kind of outcome that the law sometimes produced when the law's requirements and the facts didn't line up precisely enough. Drake remained in Harlan County. He did not approach the Bar W again. He was a diminished man in the way that men become diminished when the tool they've relied on, in his case, the presumption that people without resources or standing couldn't fight back effectively, is publicly shown to be less reliable than they'd believed. The bank continued to operate but under modified examination requirements, and whatever larger plans Drake had held for accumulating land in Harlan County had been set back by an accounting that made the costs of his methods visible. It was not a perfect resolution. Luke had stopped expecting perfect resolutions somewhere around his second cattle drive, when he'd learned that most things ended not in triumph or defeat, but in the particular mixed result of people doing what they could with what they had. Drake kept his bank, Clara Foss was somewhere in another county with two-thirds of what she'd deserved. The man Webb had spent 2 years in court and still left. Those facts didn't change because the Bar W had come out whole. But Luke had also learned, was still learning, would spend years learning it, that you didn't fight because the outcome was guaranteed. You fought because walking away from something worth keeping was a kind of loss that had nothing to do with the final accounting. Some things cost more than they give back, and you do them anyway because the alternative is being the person who didn't. By spring, the Henderson deed had transferred, the water access agreement was registered with the county, and the Bar W's debt balance, recalculated on honest terms and reduced by the restored payments, had reached a level that the ranch's operation could service comfortably within 2 years. Evelyn ran the numbers twice, which was one more time than necessary and one fewer than she probably wanted to run them, and confirmed what Luke had already calculated independently, and they told Alderman he could close the active portion of the case. Alderman sent a bill that was, as Evelyn had warned, more than he should have charged. Luke paid it without argument, because some debts are paid in full on principle even when the price is uncomfortable, and Alderman had earned most of it anyway. The ledger on the desk in the office, the one Evelyn had kept since her first day on the Bar W, the one that recorded every dollar and every decision and every mistake with the precision of someone who believed that accountability was not a burden but a practice, continued to be updated. It had a new handwriting in it now, alongside Evelyn's. Luke's entries were less detailed than hers, more cursory in their annotation, and she told him once that his description of the east drainage repair was so brief it wouldn't tell anyone what had actually been done. He told her his description was perfectly sufficient for someone who had actually repaired a drainage ditch. They compromised on more detail, which meant her version won, which was mostly how their compromises worked, because she was more often right, which he had stopped finding difficult and started finding useful. They had arguments. Real ones. Not the polite friction of people performing disagreement. Twice in the spring they didn't speak properly for a full day over decisions that genuinely mattered, and where neither of them was entirely right, and neither was entirely wrong, and both times the silence ended the same way. One of them came to where the other was working and said what needed saying, and the work resumed because neither of them had the temperament for sustained grievance when there was a ranch to run. Hatch turned 64 that April. The hands made a point of it. Evelyn baked something that she described accurately as approximately a cake, and Pete organized what he called a celebration and what mostly constituted standing around the bunkhouse, eating the approximately cake and telling stories about Hatch that Hatch himself denied with the expression of a man who remembered all of them perfectly. The little calf, who was no longer little and had never been officially named and was now called Ember by everyone including Luke, because Reuben had started it and the name had taken hold, grazed in the south pasture with the full herd and gave no indication of remembering the 2 weeks she'd spent being bottle-fed in the barn, which was fine. Some things don't need to be remembered to matter. On a morning in early May, when the weather had finally committed to warmth and the pastures were green in the particular urgent way of Wyoming springs, that know they have a limited season to accomplish anything, Luke found Evelyn standing at the east fence in the early light with her hands on the top rail and her face turned toward the ridge. He'd come out to start the morning rounds and had found Cedar already near the fence, standing beside Evelyn with the contentment of an animal in the right place. He stopped beside them. He looked at what she was looking at, the ridge, the sky above it going gold and clear, the grass moving in the first hint of wind. Thinking? He asked. Calculating, she said. Whether we can expand the herd by 15 head this season without overextending the south pasture. She paused. We can. I know we can, he said. I ran the same numbers last week. I know you did, she said. I saw your notes on the ledger page. You checked my arithmetic. I always check your arithmetic. And? And it was correct, she said, with the tone of someone for whom this remained a pleasant surprise. He stood at the fence beside her and Cedar and looked out at the Bar W in the May morning, at the solid fence posts and the healthy pasture and the cattle moving with the ease of animals that had been well cared for through a hard winter. He thought about his father, who had trusted too easily and meant too well and left behind a debt that had nearly taken all of this. He thought about riding away from this gate 2 years ago with nothing but arithmetic and stubbornness and the particular desperate optimism of someone who has no better plan. He thought about riding back and finding yellow curtains in a window. The The things that saved the Bar W were not grand or exceptional on their own. They were a woman reading a standard deed clause that no one else had bothered to read, a lawyer from Cheyenne with a briefcase, a county recorder's office that opened early, a veterinary manual ordered in advance, 11 days and a legal filing, and someone willing to spend her inheritance on a stranger's chance. And later, a man who went to the courthouse at 4:30 in the morning because he had spent 2 years doing what he could from a distance and needed to finally be in the problem. None of it was heroic in the way stories sometimes make things heroic. It was stubborn and expensive and exhausting and occasionally wrong, and it worked because two people refused to stop before it did. "Luke," Evelyn said. "Yeah." "The 15 head," she said. "I think we should look at breeding stock rather than beef cattle again. The market spread is—" "I know what the market spread is," he said. "Then you agree." "I've agreed for a week. I was waiting for you to say it first." She turned and looked at him with the expression he had learned to read. Not quite exasperation, not quite amusement. The expression of a woman who has too much good sense not to see the humor in something and too much composure to show it fully. "You could have just told me," she said. "I could have," he said, "but you were going to get there anyway, and your reasoning is usually better than mine, so I thought I'd let you arrive." "That is a very irritating quality," she said. "I know," he said, "but it saved 2 arguments this month." She shook her head, but the corners of her mouth moved. Cedar, between them at the fence rail, shifted her weight with the patience of an animal who had long since made her evaluation of both of these people and found it satisfactory. They stood there in the May morning, the 3 of them at the east fence of the Bar W, and the light came over the ridge and fell on the grass and the cattle and the solid posts, and the 2 people leaning on the top rail with the ease of people who are exactly where they are supposed to be. It was not a perfect life. It was going to have bad winters and failed harvests and animals that didn't make it, and arguments that lasted longer than they should, and legal bills that arrived at the wrong time, and decisions made too quickly, and decisions made too slowly, and every other difficulty that attaches itself to the project of 2 imperfect people trying to build something honest out of land and work, and the deliberate choice to keep going when stopping would have been easier. But the fence posts were solid, the ledger was accurate, the debt was answerable. The water rights were documented, the cattle were healthy, and every new hand who came to work the Bar W in the years that followed would eventually hear the story. Not all at once, not formally, but in pieces, over time, the way the true stories of a place accumulate. They would hear about the banker and the foreclosure notice and the widow from Missouri who showed up with a lawyer from Cheyenne. They would hear about the blizzard and the flood and the fence post pulled in January, and the veterinary manual, and the ledger that recorded everything, including the mistakes. They would hear about a man who came home after 2 years expecting to find ruins and found instead that someone had kept the thing alive because she thought it deserved the chance. And the ones who stayed long enough to understand the place would understand that the real story wasn't about a ranch being saved. It was about 2 people who each, in their own way, needed something to hold on to, and found it in the same piece of Wyoming ground, and had the sense to recognize that what they'd found was worth more than either of them had come looking for. Luke always told it the same way when someone new asked. "I rode home expecting to lose everything," he'd say, leaning on whatever fence he happened to be leaning on. Found out someone else had already decided that wasn't going to happen. And if Evelyn was within earshot, which she usually was, she'd say, without looking up from whatever she was doing, "The fence post in the south corner needed another 6 inches of depth. I should have set it deeper the first time." And Luke would say, "You fixed it in March." And she'd say, "In February." And that would be the end of the story, and both of them would go back to work. And the Bar W would go on the way it had been going, imperfectly, stubbornly, honestly. For as long as the land held and the fences were tended and the ledger was kept, and 2 people who had chosen each other without any particular certainty of outcome continued to show up at 4:30 in the morning and begin.